Spider-Man is undoubtedly one of the most iconic superheroes in comic book history. In his over 50 years of existence, he swung from the pages into television, movies, and video games. Starting as early as the Atari 2600, there was no question, however, that the king of all these games was Spider-Man 2. Based on the hit 2004 film by writer-director Sam Raimi, what should have been a phoned-in licensed video game turned out to be a revolution in the Spider-Man game genre, thanks to the minds at Treyarch, who also worked on the video game tie-in for the first film. It certainly wasn't a bad game, but it had the same problem previous games had, which was having Spidey web swing by attaching his webs to the sky. Not only that, but you would never be allowed to touch the ground either. What Treyarch had in mind for the sequel was something more ambitious, an answer to the question, how do we make a great Spider-Man game? Spider-Man 2 ditched the whole webs touching the sky crap in favor of a system that required you to attach webs to buildings while using gravity and momentum to get to where you want to go. All the while having an open world New York City where you could explore the rooftops and the city streets. This formula proved immensely successful and led the game to a solid 80 on Metacritic. If you were to ask any Spidey or gaming fan what the best Spider-Man game was, they would, without hesitation, point to Spider-Man 2. There have been other Spider-Man games since then with a similar open-world formula, but they just couldn't figure out how to match the greatness of Spider-Man 2, even though some of them were pretty decent. However, decent just won't cut it for the amazing Spider-Man, which is why Sony deemed it wise to bring their own game to the PlayStation 4 and hire the talented developers at Insomniac to craft a Spidey experience like no other. For the past 2 years since its announcement, the hype for Spider-Man on the PS4 was real, with many people hoping that this would finally be the game to dethrone Spider-Man 2. Critically, it has done just that, with a Metacritic score of 87. Still, we're going to prove if Marvel's Spider-Man on the PS4 is the game that brings Spider-Man 2 down from its pedestal, by comparing the mechanics of these two games with the following categories: traversal, combat, side activities, and story. Get ready to swing into action, because the fight between these two webheads is about to break out. We're going to begin this fight with arguably the most important feature in any Spider-Man game, traversal. What do we mean by that exactly? Well, if you've read any comic book or seen any of the movies, you would know that Spidey's main form of transportation is swinging. It's fast, reliable, and fun. Spider-Man 2 was the first game to seriously overhaul this feature. No more shooting your webs at the sky. If a building isn't in sight, there's no way you're going to swing. Treyarch put in a ton of effort to make sure swinging in this game felt more natural and realistic. Obviously, the realism of a dude with spider powers swinging across New York City with webs is certainly up for debate, but it's way more believable than magically swinging in the clouds. Spider-Man doesn't just swing off of buildings, he can also run fast and jump high. This game incorporates a jumping meter. The longer you hold the jump button, the higher your jump goes, unless you're sprinting forward, in which you can perform a faraway leap. Very handy for jumping from building to building. Climbing up walls is another popular convention of Spider-Man, but it feels slow and clunky once you figure out how to wall run using the momentum of your swings or jumps. It takes some practice. The traversal in Spider-Man 2 is great, but it's far from perfect. It's extremely easy to overshoot a jump and a swing, causing you to have to climb or swing back up and possibly miss again. This kind of gameplay style is also more favorable towards open environments, making some indoor boss battles quite frustrating. Fortunately, these negatives don't take too much away from the overall experience. Upon replaying Spider-Man 2 for the sake of this episode, it was still really fun to control Spidey despite some elements that haven't aged well, like the graphical fidelity and awkward camera in indoor settings. Thankfully, the swinging mechanic still felt as fresh as it did back in 2004. That is until I played Marvel's Spider-Man. Honestly, from the second I hit R2 to begin swinging, I almost shed a tear. What Treyarch introduced in Spider-Man 2, Insomniac Games perfected in Marvel's Spider-Man. To say that Spider-Man moves like butter would be selling this game short. He moves like whatever is smoother than butter. At its core, the swinging is very similar to the kind from Spider-Man 2, not a surprise there. It's clear that Insomniac knew just how important that game was to fans, along with what they loved about it. Rather than just copy the same movement style one-to-one, they set out to make it even better. First off, the jump meter is gone. Not like you're going to miss it though, because this game has better ways of getting to the top of buildings, such as running straight up them. No momentum needed. Holding the R2 button will keep Spider-Man moving forward regardless of what's in his way. It's called hardcore parkour, kiddos. I hardly remember times where I've simply just crawled up the wall slowly. When a game gives you the ability to move like this, you don't waste it. Then of course comes the swinging, and I don't see how it could get any better than in this game. Much like in Spider-Man 2, it also uses momentum to help speed you up. Press X near the end of a swing to give yourself a jump boost. This game also gives you the option to dive anytime you're in the air to achieve maximum momentum. Even when you're in a spot with very few buildings, like Central Park, you can use other web abilities to keep going, such as a web zip or my personal favorite, point launch. By pressing L2 and R2, you can perch on just about any ledge or pointy surface. If you hit X right upon landing, you'll jump. I'm kind of addicted to doing that. Perching is also helpful if you're trying to get to higher surfaces in quick succession, thus eliminating the need for that jump meter. Marvel's Spider-Man definitely has more variety in its ways of traversal. Even though Spider-Man 2 also gave you the ability to unlock more web-swinging moves, they weren't implemented nearly as well as they are in this new game, where they're so much easier to learn. In both games, you'll be swinging about 90% of the time, which isn't bad so long as it's fun. And in this case, it's very apparent which one is the most enjoyable. Marvel's Spider-Man starts off this fight strong, winning the Battle of Traversal. Now, being a superhero isn't all fun and games. You're going to have to fight crime in order to prove yourself a true hero of the people. Luckily, both games feature excellent combat in different ways. Let's start with Spider-Man 2. Your main antagonists in this game are going to be street thugs, armed mercenaries, along with the occasional space alien and giant robot. Upon revisiting Spider-Man 2, I found the combat to have aged surprisingly well. You beat the snot out of enemies using your fists, feet, and of course your webs. These can temporarily freeze enemies in place for some crowd control, or bring them up into the sky for a one-on-one aerial beatdown. The more you fight in the air, the more of an advantage you will have. You can even go to Spidey stores and use hero points to unlock more moves to increase your fighting gain. That said, Spider-Man would be squished without his signature Spidey senses. When his head lights up, you can dodge projectiles and counter melee attacks. Because you won't get a health pickup until a fight is ended, at least in a side mission, battles can be very tense, especially against these awful mechs. Where the combat lacks, however, is within the boss fights against main villains. Both battles against Shocker are perfect examples of this. Like I said, the game itself works best when it's set outside. These indoor fights are not made easier thanks to the camera and small size of the Shocker. Even the lock-on feature doesn't help too much. This problem is proven even further thanks to good outdoor battles against the Rhino and Doc Ock. Granted, Rhino is a stupidly easy beginner boss fight. Despite those issues, Spider-Man 2's combat built a solid foundation for other superhero games to build upon. Like Marvel's Spider-Man. If you're like me and you played these games back to back, you will notice some obvious similarities between the two in their combat, such as the aerial advantages and web abilities. This time though, Insomniac Games got insanely creative with how Spider-Man moves and utilizes his web gadgets. The move you're introduced to right off the bat is Spidey's Web Strike. With the simple press of the triangle button, you'll grapple towards an enemy and deck them straight in the face. If the enemy is unaware you exist, it'll instantly knock them out, extremely handy for some stealthy takedowns. If you're smart, you can take out a whole squad of bad guys without being noticed. Enemies in Marvel's Spider-Man range from thugs, Wilson Fisk's henchmen, a supernatural gang known as Demons, and a private security force named Sable. They all have a few things in common, like the same weapons and enemy types, but some of these weapons may have different effects. The enemy variety is solid, and the real fun begins when you decide to take them down. Not once have I complained when I got caught in a stealth section or when I saw a group of enemies nearby, because Marvel's Spider-Man has some of the most fluid and rewarding combat I have ever seen in a video game. The web slinger fights with such poise and grace to the point where even some of the bad fights look good to watch, and they only get better the further you progress. By using XP and completing story missions, you will unlock more moves to make fighting the scum of New York easier and with greater style. Attacking enemies will reward you with focus, which you can use to heal yourself or deal instant KOs. There are also a variety of suits you can unlock, each with their own special suit powers, which you can equip on any other suit. Powers can range from gaining more focus, temporary bullet deflection, and my personal favorite, iron arms, making it easier to take down baddies. The best part about this combat though are the web gadgets, which can drastically change up the battle at a moment's notice. Enemy near a wall, web him to it. Want to add shock value? Zap him. Large group of enemies, web bomb those suckers. If you know how to incorporate web gadgets into a battle, then the possibilities are limited only by the extent of your imagination. Oh hey, and speaking of Shocker, there's an indoor boss battle with him and it actually works! How crazy is that? We can't go too much into the bosses without diving into spoiler territory, but just know that they are also well made, aided by the excellent combat system. Let's face it, the combat in Marvel's Spider-Man is hard to beat, not just in terms of Spider-Man games, but video games as a whole, which is why it wins the battle for combat. New York City is a big city, and the sheer size of the Isle of Manhattan can be felt in both titles. Spider-Man 2 was the first Spidey game to feature an open-world sandbox New York City, explorable from the rooftops to the city streets. Right now, it's something we take for granted, but back in 2004, there weren't a lot of games attempting open worlds such as this. It's quite impressive when you consider that this is a licensed movie game tie-in, which, need I remind you, are games that don't have the best of reputations. Despite how impressive this was 14 years ago, that's the problem, it was 14 years ago. There have been tons of games since then that have done open world and did it better, thanks to advancements in technology along with trial and error. As a result, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there isn't much to do in Spider-Man 2's version of New York City. Actually, scratch that, there was a lot to do, just a lot of the same. In order to progress through the game's story, you have to accumulate hero points. You can get them in a variety of ways, but the best method is by finding green question marks on the map leading you to civilians who point you to a crime or people in need. Occasionally, you will encounter people in need randomly, like a child losing their balloon. You know, real hero stuff. If you're tired of fighting crime, you can take some photos, collect emblems, find some criminal hideouts, visit the arcade, and deliver pizza. So I guess the issue isn't that there isn't much to do in this game, but that there's a lot of repetitive stuff to do. Something that was fairly commonplace in open world games back in the mid-2000s. Unfortunately, time is not on Spider-Man 2's side in this battle. Marvel's Spider-Man features the same NYC we've come to expect from a Spidey game, and some fairly subtle Marvel references. Manhattan isn't the biggest open world in video games, but a wise man once told me it's not the size that matters, it's how you use it. In order to access the whole map, you have to unlock radio towers. Don't let that scare you, because there's not that many of them and they can be unlocked in a matter of minutes. Then the Big Apple and all its secrets are yours to eat. You'll unlock these side activities as you continue the story. Some missions are as simple as collecting all of Peter's old backpacks hidden around the city to uncover some entertaining lore. Others involve more dedication, like Harry Osborn's lab quests, that make Spidey do some scientific problem solving. The best part about these missions is that you won't find the same one twice. Although I don't really enjoy these simple lab puzzles. They don't last long, thankfully, but they put a dent in the momentum. And don't worry, you still fight crime, of course, responding to calls on the police scanner. Before the game came out, I was concerned that these side activities would be quite repetitive, and that fortunately isn't the case for most of them. I call them side activities because there are actual in-depth missions aptly named side missions. Don't expect them to be insanely cinematic like the ones in Witcher 3 or Fallout, but there are some that take quite a bit of time to complete, especially one involving another Spider-Man villain. There was a mission that put Spidey's private investigator skills to the test, and another where you had to find pigeons around the city. You know, real hero stuff. I have already beaten the main story, but I still have plenty of these side quests and activities to do. Sorry, Spider-Man 2, but age did not serve you well in this battle for side activities, which goes to Marvel's Spider-Man. The Spider-Man 2 game had some guidelines to follow when it came to its main story, that being to stick to the one from the movie just a little bit. Fortunately, they had more freedom to stretch their legs and include some other popular Spider-Man villains, like the Rhino, Shocker, and Mysterio. First of all, I cannot express enough just how cool that Mysterio part was. Fighting aliens is always awesome, even if they're not real. Spider-Man 2, being the licensed movie game tie-in that it is, had to regurgitate the story from the movie, and as a result, every other villain except for Mysterio feels tacked on, and adds almost nothing to the overall plot of the game. You could take out the other villains completely, and the Doc Ock story would still make sense. Still, there are cool moments to be had within the main missions. For example, the whole segment with Quentin Beck and Mysterio is hard to forget. While the challenge against Quentin Beck was a little lackluster, everything with Mysterio is just strange and absurd gold. Swinging on UFOs, fighting weird clowns, reflections come to life, what's not to like? It's a shame that this part came near the beginning, because the rest of the story pales in comparison. It sure doesn't help that the celebrities who reprised their roles from the film don't bring much to the table. No! Even playing the story missions doesn't feel as fun as swinging through New York City taking on criminals. Because of this, my expectations for the story in Marvel's Spider-Man were low. I was mostly looking forward to just swinging around the city and fighting crime. That said, the main quest in this game defied all my expectations in the best way possible. Don't get me wrong, it has some low points, like when you're not playing as the titular Spider-Man, but everything else is just so good. Not just in the way the story is told, but also the missions the story takes you on. I was always eager to go to the main mission waypoint just to see where the story would take me next and what I was going to find out. We're going to keep this section spoiler-free, but I'm going to go out on a limb here to say this. The story in Marvel's Spider-Man is not just well written, but it is better than any of the movies. Period. Fight me. So much love and attention was put into this masterfully crafted superhero story. Despite all the villains they've crammed into this game, they've somehow made it work perfectly. I had the stupidest grin on my face during some of the scenes because of how well executed they were. And do not even get me started on the final 30 minutes of the game. My jaw hit the floor with how epic the conclusion was. Maybe in time I will look back on this story and think it wasn't that great, but right now I can't help but be giddy with excitement on how much the writing team did right with Marvel's Spider-Man. Just take the win, damn it. Finally, the results are in, and to no one's surprise, Marvel's Spider-Man achieved a flawless victory over Spider-Man 2. After 14 years of games that couldn't live up to the legacy of Spider-Man 2, this is the one that did just that and then some. However, it would be unfair to simply leave Spider-Man 2 in the dust after this battle. There was a reason why so many fans considered it the best of the games for the past 14 years. Insomniac Games knew this and set out to create a title of their own that would build upon the elements of Spider-Man 2 and create an experience that fans have wanted for a long time. With near-flawless web-slinging, a satisfying combat system, and a story that not even the movies could live up to, Marvel's Spider-Man has officially earned the title of Best Spider-Man Game. Anyway, girls and guys, we hope you enjoyed our first non-Nintendo episode of Game vs. Game here on the channel. If you want to see more battles like this one, sound off in the comment section below to let us know what games you want to see duke it out. For now, be sure to hit that thumbs up if you liked this video, and if you are new, subscribe and hit that notification bell if you want to see more PlayStation and Nintendo coverage. We'd also like to thank our glorious patrons, including royal producer Kenyatta Ali, for all of their contributions to the realm. If you want to know more about how you can support us in exchange for some awesome perks, visit patreon.com/commonrealm. But in the meantime, girls and guys, this has been the Commonwealth Realm, and we will see you in the next one.